active environment. I think that's the key word here. When we say active environment, what does that mean? We want transpiration. We want stomates open. We want water flowing through the plant into the air and out of the greenhouse. That's what we're after. That's the ideal growing situation. So you want higher light levels. If you have high light levels and low humidity, your fertility has to match because they're going to be growing actively. And that's what we call the butter zone. That's where it's really good. So again, the most important thing you have to understand is transpiration is a factor of light level, temperature, and humidity. Stomates open more when the humidity is lower. The plants transpire more when the humidity is lower. So it's important to do that. But the plants also are going to drive the humidity up. So you have to make sure you're ventilating to manage that. And we'll get more into that as we talk about humidity more. So finished environmental factors, again, temperature, light, humidity. Those are the big three that we're dealing with here. We look at ADT, and that's just average daily temperature. And so you have to pay attention to that. There are extremes of high and low that will limit the growth, but the average daily temperature is sort of a barometer of your growth. So you can apply it with warmer nights or cooler nights and warmer days. But in that, you bring diff into the conversation. So as there's differences between day and night temperatures, that can affect the elongation of stems, but also can dramatically affect when and how humidity spikes, which we'll get into here momentarily. Light intensity, poinsettias like bright conditions. Transition them if you're going from shade and you're removing shade. Try to figure out a time that you can do that if you want to remove it early, that you're not going to shock it. Sometimes you can get a little scorching. You can also get some just stress on that plant that they haven't been used to that harsh of an environment, and they won't move quite as quickly.
In transitioning from a higher light level, do you find it helpful to also, say, the middle of the day, cool the crop down with with an overhead just clear water application?
Very fine overhead clear water application. I would say do it sort of early middle of the day, not in the heat of the afternoon, but going into the heat afternoon to try to create more transpiration going to the afternoon. Even clear water on a really hot leaf, especially down in Texas, you can scorch that leaf even with fresh clear water, especially if your water quality isn't ideal. If you have any kind of EC in that water, it could definitely cause some damage in the foliage.
And I would say, as a person that has done this before, keep in mind that water that's in your pipe is going to be at a higher temperature because it's sitting in that warm greenhouse the whole time. So make sure if you're going to employ that strategy, you empty and check the temperature of that water, or at the very least, put your hand under it before you put it over top of the canopy.
You brought that up because I was out watering some plants in a trial yesterday that were starting to wilt because I'm dragging them all over this place off the drip lines. And I go to water that plant and I just realized I just dumped, I don't know how hot, but it had to be like 130-degree water on that plant. And I just went, ooh, I probably killed that one. But yeah, I did not take the time to flush my hose. It's a very good point. And if your pipes are above, especially if gray PVC will get hot. So yeah, you might have to blow some water out to be careful. But if you're going to put water on top of the plant, you definitely want to make sure it's not too hot. Or conversely, later in the season, too cold either.
Yep.
Temperatures, ideally, we're talking 75 to 86. Everybody in the guys in Southern California, they just chuckle when I say stuff like this. Yeah, 86, right? How about 120? But you want to try to go for the middle zone. Poinsettias can tolerate a lot of extremes, but in extreme heat, you oftentimes see strap leaves, or in some cases, like what we call a bare paw, almost looks like the leaf is just jagged and doesn't move, and they just don't grow. That's usually heat and humidity. In heat and low humidity, they'll grow fine, and it's amazing. I've seen some poinsettias growing in the desert that I never thought would fare well, but they do. So hot, humid is really what you have to worry about. So in the deep south, or even in the Midwest, lower and upper Midwest, on those hot days, you want to make sure you're doing everything you can to try to get the humidity out. And sometimes you just have to go along for the ride. Night temperatures, 61 to 72. I wouldn't go any higher than 72 if possible. Again, there are times when you out temperature is 80, you're not going to get to 72 at night. So you're going to deal with that. 61 is not the bottom. You can go lower than that, but when you start lowering your night temperatures relative to day temperatures, you start screwing around with humidity levels, and we'll get to that here in a second. Again, ADT is about your average temperature. So 68 to 73 average. That's your average daily temperature over the 24-hour cycle is ideal. If you're up around 80, you're getting too high. Anything over about 77, 78 degrees is not a positive to a poinsettia. It's starting to very incrementally limit its growth and cause stress. So again, you can't always avoid that, but you want to be cognizant of what your goals are. And then avoid dew point. Humidity. We need it when we pinch, we need it in prop, but as soon as those breaks are formed, we hate it. You don't want it later in the season, unless you're, like I said, in the desert or something like that. But humidity causes a lot of problems. It causes a lot of problems with diseases. And one of the main problems with humidity is a phenomenon called dew point. And I'm going to explain to you what dew point is and what it means. So there's a very basic principle. Warm air holds more water than cool air, thus the term relative humidity. It's the humidity relative to the temperature. So this little graphics here are from an app that I encourage you to buy. It's a little app, free app called Dew Point. And it's the best way to understand what's going on. So if you look on the little thing on the left, you see that the temperature is 75 degrees, the relative humidity is 75 degrees. That means the dew point is 68.3. That means if that humidity doesn't change as the temperature drops at 68.3 degrees, you will start to get condensation. Whether you see it or not, it's happening. It can be microcondensation. And at that point, powdery mildew and botrytis get very happy. So now you look at the middle screen, you can say, all right, I'm going to hold my temperature at 75. I'm going to lower my relative humidity to 60. Now my dew point's down to 63. But now if you go over here and you see how important the temperature influence on a basis has way more effect on the dew point than the relative humidity. You reduce that temperature from 75 to 68 and hold your humidity at 75, the dew point drops down to 61. So if you have environment controls, you can, environment computers, you can set up purges and environment humidity management to prevent hitting dew point. But dew point is very easy to hit. And here is the scenario that is the curse. It's the end of the day. You're done. The sun's not quite down yet, and you're going home, and it's time to button up shop. So you button up the greenhouses, they close up. It's still warm in the greenhouse. You've been transpiring all day. Humidity has built up, and now you've sealed that humidity in the greenhouse. Now, let's say it was, 75 is a very modest temperature for the end of the day in a greenhouse. Let's say it was 80, but your night set point is 62. And let's say your relative humidity was 75, you're going to hit dew point way before you get down to your heat set point. And then you're going to fight diseases. So, okay, how do you manage that? If you don't have environment control, the best way to manage that is to ventilate aggressively to reduce the temperature and humidity before you put them to bed at night. That transpiration and evaporation that's happening in the greenhouse from all the water is accumulating humidity in the house. As you button that house up, boom, you seal it all in. You need to get that out before you button the house up. Yeah, you might run more heat because you cooled off too much and you're not carrying that latent heat through the day to save your heat bill, but you're also seriously reducing your disease pressure. So I encourage everybody to get this little app and start playing around with it. And the best way to play with it is to actually go out and either get a humidity monitor or have some sort of system to measure it, but go out and when your greenhouse closes up at night, plug those numbers into this thing, and you can see how cool you can get in the greenhouse that night before you hit condensation. This strategy, this basic principle will prevent botrytis and powdery mildew more effectively than anything you can do. So again,
I also have to make a point here, Gary, as we're using more temperature to control our poinsettias, and we're, to control growth at this stage. And we're employing, say, a morning dip. Yeah. This is where growers can get in trouble, and they don't realize, oh man, I just put condensation on my leaves. I just hit dew point.
Yeah, in the morning, if it's for a short period of time, so if you
not
do
horrible,
like 2 to 3 hours, it's not the end of the world. But the real problem comes is when you sit like this first graph, and let's say you're looking at that first chart, and that's your reality, and that is a very modest temperature and humidity settings. That as soon as the temperature of the greenhouse cools down to 68.3 degrees, which will probably happen like at 10 o'clock at night, you are now spending the entire night with condensation. 10 hours of dew equals germination of spores. So just keep that.
My point on the dip would probably be if you're going into a cloudy day.
Yes, absolutely. Just be cognizant of what you're dealing with here. And I think one of the strategies people do is, hey, I'm just going to cool the nights down because it saves some energy. Okay, it's a great strategy, but beware, you can burn yourself really badly with this. Cool finish. I love cool finish. But this right here is what I learned when I first played with cool finish. Hard lessons learned. And then I learned about dew point. So educate yourself on dew point. It's a great little app. I encourage everybody to play with it. It will raise your awareness of humidity and temperature in your greenhouse more than anything I know. Light level, intensity, which is foot candle or lux, quantity, moles. Intensity, you don't want it to be too high because you'll get too much infrared with that light, which is heat, which will warm the greenhouse up. If you could filter out your infrared and take the active spectrums, that's great, but it doesn't come that way. We don't get to filter out the infrared. So even a poinsettia could take more light. It's the infrared from extremely high light. So that's why we tend to shade poinsettias a little bit. And then in the South, sometimes they keep a little shade all the way through. But it's really what the plant, it's not how it's applied in intensity, it's the accumulation of moles. I come from the Pacific Northwest, where in the summer, we get great moles because we have really long days and very clear days. And in the winter, we get no moles because we'll go, for weeks and weeks without seeing the sun. So, but the really what you're after, if you're going to pick a thing to measure, it's moles. It's the quantity of light. So intensity is really about its influence on temperature. If it's too low, a stretch. But that 3,000 to 5,000 foot candle is a nice consideration. Then, of course, day length comes into play around initiations.
Hey, Gary, we had a question on the last webinar about using LEDs, I believe, in propagation, and the LEDs as far as finishing a poinsettia crop. Where do you kind of fall down in that, and do you see that more widespread?
Well, I think honestly, the time of year you're propagating a poinsettia, an LED and poinsettia propagation, I think is just it's not necessary. You don't need a lot of light to propagate a poinsettia. So I don't think it's necessary. On the finish side, if you're in a dark gray area, you can use LED to supplement your light and get some quality in the light to supplement the light. Also, LEDs are quite effective as a tool for either night interruption or day extension to manipulate your day length. So you can play both games with LED lights. But as far as supplemental lighting and poinsettia propagation, you're in a time of year that you really just don't need it. And so I think it's a waste.
The big guys that I know that do a lot of poinsettia propagation, they do not turn on their lights regularly.
The other thing with LED lights and propagation is liners grown with LED lights require a lot more feed. because as we talked about in webinar 1, you have to be careful feeding a liner because of phosphorus and phosphorus damage. The LED and props going to make you feed more, and then therefore you're going to raise your potential risk. As the outdoor environment changes, so bring changes in the greenhouse. So you have to just pay attention to what's going on. Again, the goals don't change, but the environment around you is changing. So again, if you have environment computers, that's great. That makes a lot of these decisions yourself. But it's really important that you watch this and avoid these scenarios. And again, that first cold night is dew point heaven. So that first cold day in the fall is when you oftentimes get dew. And I'm talking, if you see condensation, if you're seeing condensation on your plants or you see a cloud in your greenhouse, it's really, really bad because dew point is often invisible to the naked eye.